Welcome back to the Packet Lab. Today we're going to take a look at another in the cool Cisco iOS Commands series, and today's cool command will be default interface. And the default interface command does exactly what it says. It's going to take an interface that you specify and set it back to its default configuration. So you need to be in configuration mode, and then you're going to specify an interface, let's say 00/0. So you would type in default interface 00/0, and what it's going to do is it's going to take that interface and set it back to its default configuration. Now keep in mind that depending on what platform and or what iOS version you're running, the default configuration for an interface may be significantly different. Take for example a Cisco 3750 switch versus a Cisco 3550 switch. If you default an interface, the default configuration is going to be different on those two. And there's a couple of times when you're going to want to use this. If you've got significant configuration on a port and you just want to start from 0, go ahead and default it and it will give you the out-of-the-box configuration. The other time that you're going to want to do this is if you're not going to use a port. Say that you're using 00/1 and you're disconnecting that. You're like, we're not going to use this port anymore, so disconnect the cabling, and then rather than going in line by line saying no IP address 10.1.1.1, no encapsulation frame relay, no description, it's going to save you time. You just go in and type default interface 00/1 and it'll set it back to its default. In the usage guidelines, it says that the default command is not limited to interfaces. This is pretty cool. You can actually use this with, I'm not going to say all commands, but with most commands. So you can use this with individual configuration lines. Let's say that you want to set the encapsulation for port back to its default, but you don't want to change anything else. You don't want to change the description or the IP address or anything like that. So you just go under the interface and you would say default encapsulation, hit enter, and it'll set it back to the default encapsulation for that port. So it's pretty cool. It gives you the option to use this as a scalpel instead of always as a chainsaw. So let's take a look at this in action. So in this case, I'm on router 1 and I'm taking a look at serial interface 0/0, and here is the default configuration. There's no IP address, it's shut down, and the clock rate is at 2 megabits per second. Again, keep in mind that depending on the platform and or iOS version, these defaults may be different. So we go ahead and we've configured a bunch of stuff on here. We've thrown on a description and we haven't put an IP address on yet. We changed the encapsulation frame relay, set the load interval from 5 minutes to 30 seconds, blah blah blah, threw on some frame relay maps, disable frame relay inverse RF. So this is a configuration you might run into on an actual port that's in use. So now we're in configuration mode on R1 and we issue default interface. I didn't feel like typing out all the letters, I guess. 00/0, and it's going to say building configuration, and it's going to give you this message right here that says interface 00/0 has been set to its default configuration. Now when we go in and show the running configuration, we can see that the encapsulation, the frame relay maps, all that stuff is gone. We're back to our default configuration, or are we? This is important to keep in mind that it doesn't always set you back to an out-of-the-box configuration. In this case, here's our out-of-the-box configuration, and as we know, routers ship with their ports in shutdown mode by default. In this case, it didn't shut down the port, so it set everything back to its default configuration, but it didn't shut down the port. So always when you're configuring, what I like to do is when I make a configuration, the next thing I do is I'm taking a look at the running configuration to make sure that it took the configuration that I just put in there and it's doing what I think it is. So just keep that in mind. When you default, you may want to go back and make sure that the port is in the condition that you want it to be in. If you don't want it shut down, well, booyah. But a lot of times when you're stripping out the configuration, you want to go ahead and shut this down as well. So now it's time for me to get my Cisco geek on, because I love the combination of the default interface plus the interface range command. So the interface range command is a configuration command on Cisco switches. It may be available on a couple of routers, but basically because Cisco switches have a number of the same interface, you've got, anywhere from 8 to 48. I think there's some older switches that even do more than that, ports that are the same. So the interface range command, what you could do is you can use that to configure multiple ports at the same time. Now there's a separate video on this. I'm not going to go too deep into this. You just set an interface range and then you type in your commands, and those commands will be configured under all of the interfaces that you have specified. And the real cool thing, at least I think it is that you can use a default interface command with the interface range command. So you can go ahead and default multiple interfaces at the same time. So let's go ahead and take a look at this switch here. On switch 1, I began showing the running configuration starting with fast Ethernet 0/2, and you can see these are all configured the same. This is a port, they're assigned to VLAN 69, it's in switch port mode access, and port fast is enabled. So let's say that we get the word from on high that let's go ahead and default interfaces 2 through 5. So we go into configuration mode, we use default interface, and then we specify the range. So we're going to start with port F0/2, and then we're going to end with port F0/5. The syntax for that might be slightly different depending on your switch. Again, this is not going to be a lesson about interface range. I do want you to know, if you're familiar with the interface range command, that you can use default interface range with non-contiguous ports. So you can use your commas in here and say you want to do ports 0, 2 through 5, and then 10 as well. So you can use a comma and then F0/10. Anyways, getting a little bit more into the interface range command than I wanted to. So we go ahead and hit enter. We don't get any fireworks, but now when we go ahead and take a look at our running configuration, starting with fast Ethernet 0/2, we see that it's been set to its default configuration, which in the case of a 3550 is switch port mode dynamic desirable. So this is really cool, especially on switch, because what you're looking at if you don't have this command, if you don't have either of these commands really, is that you'd have to go into each port. Okay, I'm in F0/2. Now I have to go ahead and put no description. This is a port. No switch port view. No. And go ahead and take out each of these lines one by one. That is monotonous. With this, you can go ahead and just hit it like that. And the other thing about going line by line and issuing the no command before your configuration is that unless you know what the defaults are, you might go ahead and disable a default configuration. So let's say in this case we had to go through line by line. So we get under fast Ethernet 0/2, and for the sake of argument, let's say that port fast is enabled by default on all ports. So I go ahead and no description, no switch port access VLAN 69, no switch port mode access. I get down here, no spanning tree port fast. Well, at that point, I've disabled what is a default. So I've turned off port fast, and again, that's not true, but for the sake of argument, I can go ahead and turn off something that's a default. With the default interface command, you're not going to do that because it knows what the defaults are and it just sets it back to default. So that's another bonus with this. All right, and it is mentioned in the usage guidelines, you can use a default command and not use it with an interface. You can use it with most configuration lines. So in this case, we're on a router and we have the default host name of router. So we set the host name. We're like, okay, host name R1. Now if we go ahead and say default host name, so we're saying default, and then the configuration command, we can see that we have been set back to our default host name of router, and we don't have to look at the running configuration for that. As a matter of fact, looking at the running configuration isn't always going to show you this, as we'll see in the next step. So here on R1, I've gone ahead and set up a default gateway, and then I said, oh man, I don't need that. So I could type in no IP default gateway 10.1.1.1. Sometimes with no commands, depending on how much of the command you specify, you might be turning off the entire command. You might only be turning off part of the command. So you might have a long command here that I can't think of one off the top of my head, but say that there was another argument that went with the default gateway, and it's I don't know, boobies. So if you issued no IP default gateway 10.1.1.1 boobies, you might be turning off this entire configuration line. You might just be getting rid of the boobies argument and might still have this in here. Using the default command is going to set it back to its default. So that's a good thing to keep in mind as well. So anyways, we issue default and then IP default gateway. We don't have to put in the whole configuration there. Hit enter, and now we do a show run and include IP default gateway. There's nothing there. That's one of the downsides of working with default configurations, is that most, not all, and it varies by platform/iOS version, but most default configurations do not show up in the running configuration. So when you go ahead and take a look for this configuration line, it's gone. You need to know that that's gone because it's supposed to be gone, because it's default. Cisco iOS doesn't show default configuration. So we done good with this one, but just keep that in mind. It might get a little confusing and like, oh, it didn't default it, it just got rid of it altogether. Well, it actually did default it. Okay, and I'm on a 3640 that I'm emulating in Dynamips, and it should be set to its default. You can see we do have the default host name of router, so I'm going to go ahead and let's take a look at the running configuration for 0/0, and there we go. This is default on here. It's going to have no IP address. It's going to be shut down. Serial restart delay is set to 0, and no DCE terminal timing enable. So anyways, that's what you'll see when it's defaulted. So let's go in and I'm going to configure this. I'm actually going to pause because I'm going to throw a bunch of configuration on here. Okay, so I've thrown a bunch of configuration on this interface. If I do show take a look at the running configuration on S0/0. I put on a description, an IP address. I've changed the encapsulation frame relay, blah, blah, blah. It's still in shutdown mode. Let's go ahead and do a no shut on that. It won't come up because the other side isn't configured to work with this configuration. Anyways, I've got a ton of configuration on here, and we take a look at the interfaces on here, I have a number of serial interfaces. So we can use do show run int s0/1. That is still in its default configuration. So we could compare this configuration, which is a default, with our configuration on s0/0 and see that it is crazy different. So now the word comes down that says, let's go ahead and stop using this interface. I want you to take off all the configuration. So now I could go in line by line and start taking this out. You know, interface 00/0, no description, no IP address, no encapsulation, blah, blah, blah. We're going to go ahead and use our default interface command. And we're going to specify s0/0. There we go. We can see here it's telling us it's been set to its default configuration. So let's go ahead and take a look at this guy now. And booyah, we are back to our default almost. So now if I go take a look at s0/1, do you see the difference between these two ports? The difference is that s0/1 is in shutdown, whereas this port is open. So again, like I said in the theory portion, make sure you go back in and check to make sure that everything is the way that you want it to be. In this case, the interface does not get shut down, although that is the default, which is interesting because let's go ahead and try this s0/1. So we're going to default an interface that's already at its out-of-the-box default and see what happens. So 00/1 I've done no configuration on, and that's the command, that's the configuration that we're showing right here on it. This is what it is out of the box. So let's see what happens when we run the default interface command on an already defaulted interface. Ooh, so now it's been set back to its default configuration. So it should be exactly the same way it was because it was already in its default configuration, and it is. For whatever reason, it got rid of the restart delay 0, but it's still shut down. So it's just not doing anything with the port opening up or shutting it down. Anyways, the takeaway from that is that even though you're defaulting this interface, make sure you go back in and do a show running configuration on that interface to make sure it's in the state that you want it to be. So now we saw in the usage guideline that we can default individual commands as well. What I could do here is I've set the host name to R1. I could go ahead and set default host name, and you can see here now that the host name has changed to router, which is its default. Do show run include host. You can see it's host name router. Now a lot of commands aren't going to show this. Let's see here. Let me think of one. Well, let me do the example that I had in the slides. If I do IP default gateway 10.1.1.1, hit enter, and now I do a do show run include default -G. That should be enough. Whoops, I forgot the I. Okay, we can see that we've configured a default gateway. Now if I want to default that, I could go in and just type no interface or IP default gateway, but I can also just say default. Oh, I see I can't type. And now if I do a show run and include that, it's not going to show up because by default there is no interface or IP default gateway configured, so that command does not show up in the running configuration when it's at its default. So just keep that in mind. So now I'm connected to a console port of a Cisco 3550 switch. You may hear the fan of said switch in the background. And what I wanted to show you was that not only is default interface a very cool command, but it can be used in combination with another extremely cool command, which is the interface range command. And I'm not going to go too deep into that command because there is another lesson specifically on that command. This is something that you really want to know, especially if you're working with switches, because it will save a ton of time with configurations. So let's get into configuration mode. And what I want to do is I want to do a show run, and I want to begin with interface 0/1. I just want to see the interfaces. I don't want to see the rest of the configuration. So you can see here that interface F0/1 does have some configuration on it, and we're going to leave that. We're going to pretend that that's our uplink to our core switch. But then the rest of the interfaces are all in their default configuration, which on a 3550 is switch port mode dynamic desirable. If you're on a different platform, this may be different. I know that if you're on 3560, it's not going to be using desirable.